So I lived in this duplex for about 2 years in my late 20s, and I need to tell you about the guy downstairs, and I want to be upfront that this story doesn't have a clean ending with a bow on it, because real things rarely do. What it has instead is a series of experiences that built on each other slowly, and then a conversation that explained some of it and deepened the rest of it, and then a move-out that left me with more questions than I started with. That's the shape of it. Not a horror story. Not a ghost story exactly. Something quieter and stranger than either of those. The duplex was a converted Victorian in one of those Midwestern neighborhoods that was grand once, around the turn of the century, and then went through a long middle period of subdivision and rental and gradual shabbiness, and was in the process of being slowly reclaimed by the time I moved in. Old house, high ceilings, the original hardwood floors under the carpet that a previous owner had laid down at some point and that my landlord had pulled up before I arrived. Big windows with the original wavy glass that I was starting to recognize as a feature of a certain era of Midwestern construction. I was on the upper floor. The lower unit had its own entrance on the side of the house. When I moved in, the lower unit was empty. It had been empty for a couple of months, my landlord told me, and she was in the process of finding a new tenant. She found one about 3 weeks after I got there. I saw them move in from my upstairs window on a Saturday afternoon in October. A man, alone, with a modest amount of stuff. A few boxes, some furniture that looked old and heavy and was moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who either couldn't afford help or preferred not to have it. I didn't go down to introduce myself that day because he seemed focused, and I didn't want to interrupt, and I told myself I'd do it later. Later never quite happened. I'd see his car in the driveway, an older model sedan, dark blue, always clean, and I'd hear occasional sounds from below. The particular muffled quality of downstairs neighbor sounds, footsteps, and the low murmur of a television. Normal. I'd think about going to knock on his door and introduce myself and somehow always find a reason to do it another time. It was maybe a month after he moved in that I first noticed the 3 a.m. thing. I'm a light sleeper. Always have been, especially in a new place, and 2 months into the duplex I was still calibrating to its sounds, still sorting the "this is normal" sounds from the "this needs attention" sounds. So when something new happened, I tended to notice it. What I noticed was that, at some point in the 3 o'clock hour, sometimes 3, sometimes 3:15, occasionally as late as 3:40, but always within that window, I'd hear the side door of the lower unit open and close, and then footsteps on the exterior stairs and on the path, and then a car door, and then the sound of the sedan starting and pulling out of the driveway. Not every night, maybe 3 times a week, sometimes 4, but consistently always in that same window, always the same sequence of sounds. Door, steps, car door, engine, gone. I'm the kind of person who, once I've noticed a pattern, can't unnotice it. So I started tracking it without meaning to, the way you track anything that becomes a feature of your sleep environment. A few times I got up and looked out the window, and I'd see the sedan's taillights disappearing down the street, the red glow of them through the old glass, and then nothing. Where does a person go at 3 in the morning, 3 or 4 times a week? There are reasonable answers to that. Night shift job, obviously. That's the first and most sensible one. But the timing was off for a standard night shift. If you're working at 10 to 6 or an 11 to 7, you leave before 3, not at 3. And he came back. That was the other part. He'd be gone for an hour, sometimes 2, and then I'd hear the sedan return, in the side door, and then quiet. Not a shift then. Too short, too irregular. The other thing I noticed, concurrent with the departures, was that I almost never saw him during the day. His car was in the driveway. I'd occasionally hear him below me in the evenings, but in terms of actually laying eyes on the man, actually seeing him in person in daylight or anywhere near daylight hours, it almost never happened. I'd lived above him for 3 months before I realized I couldn't have described him with any confidence. I'd gotten that one impression from his move-in day, seen from a second-floor window, male, probably around my age or a bit older, medium build. That was it. I finally saw him properly in January. It was a Sunday evening, around 5, that deep blue, early dark of midwinter, and I was coming back from the grocery store, and he was standing on the side porch of his unit when I pulled in. He was just standing there in his coat looking out at the street. He turned when I got out of the car and we looked at each other for a moment and I said, "Hey," and he said, "Hey back." He was maybe 35, a few years older than me, regular looking in the way that some people are regular looking in a way that makes them hard to describe afterward. Average height, brown hair, the kind of face that's pleasant without being particularly distinctive. But his eyes were interesting, which sounds like a strange thing to notice in a 5-second parking lot interaction. But they were very light, very clear, with a quality of attention in them that was more alert than the situation called for. Not nervous, just attentive, like he was taking in more information than most people bothered to collect from a passing exchange. He said his name was Thomas. I said mine. He asked if I'd settled in okay upstairs. And I said, yeah, great place. He said he liked it too. We talked for maybe 3 minutes in the cold January dusk, and then we both went inside and that was that. But it was something. The first actual conversation. The first time I had a face to put to the footsteps and the 3 a.m. departures. Thomas, pleasant, attentive eyes, alone in the lower unit, with his old heavy furniture and his irregular nights. I want to tell you about one night in February, because it's the experience that shifted this from a vague curiosity into something I thought about more seriously. I was awake around 3, not unusual for me in winter. Something about the cold and the dry heat from the radiators disrupted my sleep, and I heard the usual sequence from below. Door, steps on the path, but this time I was already at the window before I decided to get up, the way you sometimes move before you've consciously made the choice. It was a clear night, cold and still, the snow on the ground reflecting the streetlight so the yard was lit up brighter than you'd expect at that hour, and I saw Thomas on the path below, heading toward the car. And he stopped. For no apparent reason, he just stopped walking about halfway to the car and stood still for a moment, and then he turned and looked directly up at my window. Now, my light was off. It was 3 in the morning, and I was standing at a dark window looking down, and there was no reason he should have known I was there. But he turned and looked directly at my window, and he stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds, and then he turned back and walked to the car and drove away. I stood at the window for a while after that. The yard was empty and quiet, and the snow was very white in the streetlight, and there was nothing to see. But the certainty that he had known I was watching, had felt it, had turned to look, had acknowledged it without surprise, had turned away again and carried on as though it were simply a thing that happened. That certainty sat in me for the rest of the night. Spring came and the 3 a.m. departures continued. I ran into Thomas occasionally meaning about once a month, given how rarely he seemed to be around during normal hours, and we'd exchange a few sentences and he'd be pleasant and attentive-eyed and unrevealing, and I'd go back upstairs with slightly more impression of him as a person and no more idea of what his life actually consisted of. In April, I finally asked him. I decided I was just going to ask, directly in the neighborly way that's acceptable and not intrusive if you do it right. We were both getting our mail at the same time, which was practically a scheduled event given how rarely our paths crossed, and I said something like, "I feel like you keep unusual hours. Do you work nights?" And he smiled an easy smile and said something like, "You could say that." I waited. He looked at me for a moment with those light, attentive eyes, and then he said, "I have a hard time with certain hours. 3 in the morning is the worst of it, so I've learned to just get up and drive." I said that made sense, that some people found driving calming, that movement helped. He said, "It's not quite that." He paused. "It's more that there are things that happen at that hour in an indoor space that don't happen when you're moving. I've found that being in motion helps keep them at a distance." I stood there with my mail and I said carefully, "What kind of things?" He looked at me for another moment. That assessing quality in his gaze, the same thing I'd noticed when we first met. Then he said, "I see things, at that hour, in that specific window of time. I always have, since I was a child. It's not frightening anymore. I've made a kind of peace with it, but it's disruptive to sleep, so I drive." I asked what he saw. He said it was hard to describe to someone who hadn't experienced it. He said it was like, and he paused here, choosing words carefully, like the regular world got thin, like the layer of things that we perceive as solid and stable, were transparent for a while, and through the transparency other things were visible. People, sometimes. Presences, things that were connected to wherever he was, to the history of a place, to whatever had happened in a space before he was in it. He said the duplex was a quiet one, actually. He'd lived in worse, I said, and I'm not sure what made me say it except that it seemed like the right question. I said, that night in February when you stopped on the path, you looked up at my window. He said yes. I said, did you know I was there? He said yes. He said he felt me watching for several nights actually. He said it wasn't a problem, he didn't mind, he was used to people noticing his habits and being curious. He said it was actually easier when someone was curious and direct about it rather than pretending they hadn't noticed. We talked for a while longer, there in the April sunshine with our mail. He told me a little more, that it had started when he was young, that it ran in his family, that his mother had had it too and her father before her, that there was a long tradition in certain families of this particular sensitivity to that particular hour when whatever divided things was at its most permeable. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe a chronic condition that you've long since integrated into the logistics of daily life. Not dramatic, not asking me to believe him, just telling me, since I'd asked. I asked him if it was lonely. He thought about it. He said the driving isn't lonely. That part I've come to like, actually. Empty roads at 3 in the morning are some of the most peaceful things there are. There's nobody out there but people like me, people who have reasons to be up at that hour. And there's a kind of fellowship in that, even when you never speak to each other. You see the same truck at the same all-night diner, the same car on the same stretch of road. You're all just passing through the thin hours together. I moved out of the duplex about 4 months after that. Different reasons. New job, different neighborhood, practical stuff. Thomas and I said a proper goodbye when I left. Brief, but genuine. The kind of goodbye that acknowledges that something real passed between two people, even if it was quiet and small. He shook my hand on the front path and wished me well, and I wished him the same. I've thought about him a lot over the years. I think about the thin hours, that phrase he used, the hours when what divides things becomes permeable. I think about him on empty roads at 3 in the morning, moving through that transparency, keeping it at a manageable distance. I think about the fellowship of the people who pass each other in those hours without speaking. Sometimes now, when I wake up at 3 and can't get back to sleep, I lie in the dark and I think about what Thomas said, that there are things visible in that hour, in indoor spaces, to people who are made to see them. I think about what might be visible in my particular space, in my particular 4 walls, if I had the eyes for it. What the history of the rooms I sleep in might look like if the layer got thin enough. It doesn't frighten me. That's the thing I've carried from Thomas more than anything else, that whatever exists in the thin hours is not something to be frightened of. It's just something to navigate, a feature of reality that most people aren't built to perceive, that a few people are, and that those few have to find their own way of living alongside. Empty roads at 3 in the morning. Passing strangers in the thin hours, the particular peace of being in motion when the world is most transparent. I hope Thomas is doing all right out there. I hope the roads are quiet. I hope whatever he sees is gentle with him.